Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm Jon Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 90 countries around the world with news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. Currently, I'm a member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. As we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge and thank today's premier national sponsor, EMD Serono, and our national sponsor, Janssen. Support from MS community partners helps the National MS Society reach its goal of providing up-to-date information and support through programs like Ask an MS Expert. Thank you to all of you who are joining us on GoToWebinar, Facebook Live, and YouTube Live. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to connect you with MS experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. So as I chat with our expert today, please feel free to post your questions on Facebook and YouTube, or type them into the question box if you're joining us on GoToWebinar. We'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A portion of today's program. According to a study funded by the National MS Society, nearly 1 million people are living with MS in the United States. And we know that MS doesn't discriminate. It impacts people of all ages, sexual orientations, ethnic backgrounds, and geographic locations. But when it comes to access to care, and even the course of the disease itself, can the same thing be said? Dr. Martin Luther King said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. February is Black History Month, and today we're talking with Dr. Mitzi Williams about the impact of the social determinants of health on MS outcomes and what can be done to achieve health equity for all people affected by MS. Dr. Williams is a board-certified neurologist and fellowship-trained multiple sclerosis specialist who's passionate about educating and empowering people affected by MS to understand the disease process and the goals of treatment. Dr. Williams is a sought-after consultant, speaker, researcher, and author, and she's an expert in understanding MS in underserved and ethnic minority populations. Dr. Williams collaborates with national and international committees to advocate for people living with MS, and she's dedicated to raising awareness about the importance of research participation and encouraging diversity in clinical trials. Dr. Williams is also a member of the MS Society's National Board of Directors, and she recently helped launch the Society's first Black MS Experience Summit this past year. Welcome back to Ask an MS Expert, Dr. Williams, and thank you for joining us today.
It is absolutely my pleasure to be with you today, John. Thank you for having me.
You know, for the longest time, people thought that MS only affected young white women. Now we know that narrow definition is wrong. It doesn't begin to represent the broad range of people who have been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So Dr. Williams, what do recent studies tell us about the incidence of MS by race? And for our audience, the incidence of MS refers to the number of people who are newly diagnosed with MS within a given period of time.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So as you said, we certainly used to think that MS is mostly a young white woman's disease. And if we look at the incidence or the occurrence of MS worldwide, that still is largely the case. But here in the US, over the past 10 years or so, we've had some data that suggests that actually not only is the incidence or occurrence of MS higher in Black people, the risk may be up to 47% higher in Black women. The risk is still lower in the Hispanic community, the Hispanic Latin X community, but certainly there are some things that we'll talk about later in terms of how the disease presents itself and how it may progress, that certainly makes these several of these groups of very much of interest for us to study.
Is there a difference between the number of women and men who are affected by MS in minority populations?
So it's very similar to what we see in the overall population. So we know that MS is much more common in women. We used to think twice as common. Now it's more like 3 times as common. And particularly in the Black population, it may be 4 times more common in women than men. So similar, but maybe a little bit higher in women as well.
We've heard that there is some sort of genetic component to MS. So do genetic factors play a role in determining who develops MS?
So they do, but the genetics is extremely complicated. So with certain diseases, for instance, like sickle cell, we know if the mom has a gene, dad has a gene, we can predict 1 in 4 of the children may have the disease. With MS, there are over 200 different genes that are associated with increased risk, many of which we don't actually know what the total function of those genes are. So genetics plays a part, and certainly if someone has a first-degree relative, a parent, or sibling with MS, it increases your risk, but the risk overall is still low in the general population.
The prevalence of MS varies geographically. Some areas see a greater number of people living with MS compared to other geographic areas where MS prevalence seems to be very low. What do we know about how geographic location affects the distribution of MS? And what happens to people who migrate from one geographic area to another?
So there's a lot that we need to learn about the environmental factors that affect MS. We do know that the further away you are from the equator, generally it's thought the higher the risk for MS, which is why we see much higher incidences like in Europe than we do in the US, and much lower incidences in tropical areas such as Africa, for instance. So when we think about the migration, the thought is that if you move from a low risk to a high risk area, let's say before the age of 15, then you take on the risk of that area and vice versa. But there's still a lot that we don't understand about what in the environments may be causing that. Certainly, there are thoughts that it may be related to diet, since there's a lot of study with the gut and how the gut activates the immune system. And then there also is a lot of interest in vitamin D, since in some areas there may be lower exposure to vitamin D. So there's a lot that we have to learn, but certainly we know which areas are higher risk, but we don't quite know what makes those areas higher risk.
There's some evidence that the clinical presentation of MS is actually different in different populations. Dr. Williams, what are some clinical characteristics of MS in Black, Hispanic, or Latinx people, and how might it present differently?
Yeah, so there are some key differences. So I think one of the main differences that we see is the outcomes. So we certainly see more disability in the Black population as well as in the Hispanic Latinx population, meaning more spinal cord disease, so more difficulty with walking. There are studies that suggest that Black people may reach a disability level of, it's the scale called the EDSS. And when you reach a level of 6, that means that you need some assistance with walking, whether it's with a cane or a walker. And there are studies that suggest that Black people reach that milestone up to 6 to 10 years earlier than their white counterparts. There are also multiple studies looking at MRI, looking at other outcomes that suggest that, even visual outcomes can be worse in the Black population. I think one of the biggest issues with understanding this is that we don't know what part of that actually has to do with the biology of the disease, meaning are people genetically slightly different where they may have more aggressive disease, or which part of it has to do with what we call social determinants of health. So things like access to care, access to medications, et cetera.
We're going to get into some of those social determinants of health in just a couple of moments. Um,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, when it comes to the initial onset of MS, are there age differences among minority populations?
Yes, so the Hispanic population usually presents a couple of years younger than the white population, and then the Black population may present a couple of years older. There's some studies that suggest that patients may present a couple of years older versus a couple of years younger, than the white population, but certainly Hispanic is younger.
What about the proportion of MS subtypes, like relapsing forms or progressive forms of MS, are those also different in minority groups?
So overall, most people still start out with relapsing remitting MS. I think that one of the main differences is the speed of progression, or the speed of which there's a transition from relapsing to progressive MS. So we do see a faster transition in Black patients than we do in white patients, but overall, it doesn't appear that Black patients have more, for instance, primary progressive MS versus relapsing MS, but they do make that transition to progressive disease more quickly.
Neurologists see MS by reviewing and analyzing MRI images. Are there some differences in MRI findings in minority populations with MS?
So absolutely, if we look at the Hispanic Latinx community, there appear to be what we call longitudinally extensive spinal cord lesions. So MS affects the brain, the optic nerves, and the spinal cord. And in the Hispanic population, some of those spinal cord lesions are actually kind of long, which can make it a little bit more confusing because there's a disease that's similar to MS called DeVick's disease, or NMO, where we see those long lesions, but that actually is a part of MS in the Hispanic community. In the Black community, we tend to see more optic nerve, meaning visual problems, and more spinal cord involvement. And the reason that that's important is because spinal cord involvement is often more associated with walking disability, and motor disability can certainly lead to more significant or poor outcomes on the back end.
Well, before we continue, I'm sorry, I have one more question I see I want to get
Yeah,
to. What about MS
yeah.
treatments? Are there some MS therapies that are more effective than others in specific minority populations?
So that is also an excellent question that we really don't have enough data to give a definitive answer for. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important to increase the diversity of our clinical trials. So when we look at most of our major clinical trials for our MS therapies, the number of minority patients is extremely low. And we know that this is a problem across the board for most disease states, but particularly with MS. For most of our trials, we're talking anywhere from 10 Black people to maybe 50. I think the largest trial may have had 70. And some of those trials were trials that were conducted versus placebo. So even if you had 50 people in that trial, half of them may have been on placebo and not been on the actual medication. So it's very hard to make generalizations with such small numbers of people. There are newer studies that are coming out looking at what we call real world data in the clinics, where so far it appears that the efficacy or effectiveness of medicine seems to be equal between white and Black populations. But certainly we need more information from those clinical trials, and we need more diverse and representative populations to really answer that question.
I want to take just a moment to welcome those of you who have continued to join us on GoToWebinar, Facebook Live, and YouTube Live. Please let us know what's on your mind. Post your comments and questions on Facebook and YouTube, or type them into the question box if you joined us on GoToWebinar. MS navigators are also online throughout today's program, answering questions and providing resources. Our Ask an MS Expert live event takes place at this same time every Friday. So please help us make sure that everyone knows about it by sharing news about the webcast with your family, with your friends, and on all your social channels. Despite increased awareness about MS in ethnic minority populations, many factors impact the opportunities someone has to be healthy. We can see that health outcomes and access to care can vary widely among minority populations. Dr. Williams, can you define health equity for our viewers?
Right. So health equity really is a picture of people having the same access to care, the same access to treatments, and basically the same treatment within the healthcare system, right? Because even sometimes when people have the same access, there are factors such as implicit bias on the part of medical providers that may affect the type of care that people receive. So it's not only having access to care, but having equal outcomes, or the ability to have equal outcomes with care.
And that kind of brings me to my next question.
Mhm.
Even though MS affects all races and ethnicities, minority populations may suffer an unequal burden from the disease. What are the health disparities in MS?
Yeah, so health disparities, have been a topic that's been highlighted, especially since the pandemic. And I think that, one of the good things, even though it's still sad that we have so many disparities in care, one of the good things is that it really gives us an opportunity to shine a light on things that need to be changed. So when we talk about health disparities, again, there is less access to care. There are several studies that suggest that Black people are less likely to be able to see a neurologist for care for their MS. And if you see a neurologist, and this isn't even talking about an MS specialist, this is just talking about a neurologist. So if you at least have access to a neurologist, you may have access to some disease modifying therapies, symptom management, things of that nature. And so 30 African Americans are 30% less likely to even be able to see a neurologist. And when you look at overall care for neurology, they were also less likely to have access for neurologists, not just for MS, but for other conditions. So, that absolutely affects outcomes. I think another large issue is access to resources. So if people lose insurance, if people have a low socioeconomic status, even if they theoretically have access to a specialist, you have to get there. You may have to take a day off of work, which may affect your income and your living. So there are many factors, I think, that are affecting the outcomes that we see and affecting the disparities in access to care for minority communities. And then also for the Hispanic Latinx community, language can also be a barrier. Even though we have language lines where we can have translators, it still takes away that personal element and may make it more difficult for healthcare providers to establish trust within the relationship, because we have to have someone that kind of goes between to translate what we're trying to convey.
Just a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned the social determinants of health. Can you tell us
Mhm.
what that means? What are they?
Right. So I think social determinants of health really encompass many of the factors that affect our healthcare outcomes aside from our actual physical health. So physical health is not the only reason that people have poor outcomes. So it's things like access to education, right? Health literacy, our understanding of what treatments are can be related to our education level. It also means transportation. So in order to get to visits, you may need transportation. How far do you live from medical facilities? If you live in certain parts of cities, you may live very far from a medical facility. So you won't go to the doctor until something really severe is bothering you, because it would take you so long to get there. Also, access to digital technology. In the age of telemedicine, we're doing a lot of visits remotely, but if you don't know how to use the technology, or let's say you live in an area, a rural area, or a home or area where you don't have good internet, you still aren't able to access care. So there are many factors, including those things: economic status, transportation, educational level, access to media, that affect your health outcomes. And so those are the social determinants of health versus the actual physical determinants of health, the shape that your body is in.
I know that there are a lot of legislative remedies to extend and expand things like telehealth so that communities where it's not convenient to see that MS specialist, for instance, can now perhaps get access. But part of that solution is going to have to solve what you just talked about, and that is access, broadband internet
Absolutely.
connectivity, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, there are a lot of different ways we can look at it. I think one of the great things about the pandemic, though, is that it has made things that we thought were impossible very quickly possible. So telemedicine is something that's been, discussed and kind of tried to be implemented in the field of MS for some time, but there were so many barriers. There's no way we can do it. We can't do it in people's homes. We can't do this. We can't do that. And so you see, when a crisis arose, it got done. And so all of a sudden, everyone's doing telemedicine. So I think that it shows that sometimes there are many structural barriers in place that are keeping us from providing, adequate care to people. But it certainly has allowed us to reach more people and allowed physicians to actually be reimbursed for their time, because previously these services couldn't be reimbursed for. So I think that this has taught us that what we say we can't do, we absolutely can get done if we have to.
We know that a healthy diet, regular exercise, stress management, and other wellness strategies can make a real difference when it comes to managing MS symptoms and improving quality of life. Are there differences in how these health behaviors are embraced in minority ethnic groups that might actually impact their MS presentation and disease progression?
Yeah, so absolutely, a healthy diet and exercise is extremely important to overall health. We know that some of the risk factors for MS, aside from things like low vitamin D, are obesity and smoking. So certainly, and there's also been a lot of research, as I already stated, looking at the gut. What kind of foods do we eat? Are we eating inflammatory diets that are kind of spurring on or starting this MS process? One of the difficulties for minority communities is that they often have higher levels of comorbidity, so other diseases like diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, and again, it may possibly be related to access. So there are many parts of the country where people live in what we call food deserts. So there may not even be a grocery store anywhere near their neighborhood. There may be a corner store that just has like certain snacks, maybe a limited number of food items, but certainly not like a farmer's market where you can get fresh vegetables and fresh fruits. And so if the diet is limited, it certainly may limit some of the options people have. And also, eating healthy can be expensive, right? So those fresh organic Brussels sprouts are, much more expensive than, let's say, a box of cereal or a box of pasta that may last you a longer period of time. So there are a lot of, again, barriers to healthy living that may affect those comorbidities and in turn affect people's outcomes with MS because they tend to do worse if they have those other diseases in combination with MS.
A few minutes ago, we were talking about disparities in access to quality neurologic care. And
Yes.
you mentioned several of them. I'm wondering about another one. What about racial bias? So it's not a matter of having to take 3 or 4 buses to get to an appointment, but what about what happens at that appointment? Does racial bias exist when it comes to diagnosing someone with MS? And can that actually delay diagnosis?
So the short answer is yes. There's a lot of people within the MS community that are looking at, some of these social determinants of health, especially delay in diagnosis. And there are still people who come to my office who said the doctor said I couldn't have MS because I'm Black. So even though there's research that's been around for the past decade suggesting that the incidence is higher in Black populations, especially if you're in an area and you don't have access to an MS specialist, it's very hard to keep up with all of the literature unless you're particularly interested in that topic. So while, neurologists may be trying to keep up with just the slew of new therapies that have come to date, that have, come out in the past 10 years, it's difficult to keep up with some of those other things. So I think that there definitely is a lack of awareness. And I think that there definitely is bias. Many African Americans traditionally were diagnosed with psychiatric problems when they first presented with MS. They may have also been misdiagnosed with other conditions, pinched nerves, sciatica, etc., when the symptoms are very typical of MS. And there have been multiple examples of people who had even dramatic symptoms, and MS has not been on the top of the list for whoever is seeing them. And so that's what makes, one of the diagnoses a little bit difficult is because someone has to think about it, because you can almost always come up with another explanation for some of the symptoms, but you have to think about MS and you have to go looking for it. So certainly that plays a role in the outcomes and delay of diagnosis as well.
It's been pretty well documented that minority groups are underrepresented in MS clinical trials.
Yes.
My question is why? What are some factors that contribute to the lack of racial and ethnic diversity in clinical research?
Yeah, so there are patient factors and there are institutional factors. And I, every time I give a talk about this, I start talking about it as a decreased enrollment instead of decreased participation. because when we say participation, it seems to put all the onus on the person, and that person just doesn't want to be bothered with it, where there are actual institutional barriers. So if we break it down and look at the patient barriers, some of those are certainly mistrust of the medical system, especially if you think about the Black community. There's a very long and sordid history of unethical studies that have been done, even into the 20th century, right? So we're not talking about stuff that was done a long, long time ago. Within even my parents' generation, some of these unethical studies were conducted, including this Tuskegee syphilis study. And so, there's that factor. There also is lack of awareness, where to find out about research studies. If your local neurologist is not doing studies, or you don't have access to an MS center, you may not even be aware. And then on the institutional side, there are barriers such as, very strict criteria. So we know that minority populations have a higher incidence of diseases like diabetes, hypertension. And if the criteria is so strict and so narrow that you essentially have to be in perfect health to get into the study, you may automatically exclude large populations of people. And then other institutional barriers are certainly provider bias. There may be a sense that maybe African Americans or other minorities may say no from past experience, or that they don't want to be involved in research, or that they may not be compliant with the studies, which I've actually had a colleague say that to me about concern about enrolling people in studies. And I think the other bigger thing from a larger view is when we look at our industry partners, the locations where they choose sites for studies. So if you don't have diverse populations and you keep going to the exact same places over and over again, you're going to get the exact same results. So there has to be some investment and some intentionality in investing in, for instance, minority investigators, maybe sites that are smaller, that are not your huge academic centers, that may need some additional help to get up and running, but certainly have access and the trust of that community. So there are a lot of different factors in play, but I want to make sure that, it's not just something that's put on the patient that they absolutely don't want to participate. There are other barriers in place for those that do want to participate, but aren't able to.
You mentioned the Tuskegee study, and just for clarification for our audience, the Tuskegee study was a clinical research project that was designed to look at the disease course of syphilis. The researchers went ahead and recruited Black men, not telling them it was a syphilis study, told them it was a blood study. And at a point in the study, when a treatment for syphilis was confirmed,
a cure,
penicillin, it was never offered to any of the participants, and they continued to get worse and worse and worse in a horrible way for no good reason at all.
And most of them died.
Exactly. So I was going to ask you to talk about the importance of enrolling in MS research studies, especially if you're a member of a minority community who is not being represented in that work.
Absolutely. So, I think that one of the things is that because of experiences like the Tuskegee experiment, which are kind of in the collective memory of certain communities, not necessarily that they were a participant or anyone in their family, but these things are kind of part of the collective history that people talk about in their homes with their parents and their grandparents. And I think that because of that, clinical research has almost really gotten a bad rap, so to speak. There are a lot of great things about clinical trials, right? So it's access to cutting edge medicine, right? Access to care, top scientists, there are protocols in place. It really almost eliminates some of those social determinants of health, because everybody's on a level playing field. Everybody has access to the doctor. Everybody has access to MRIs. Everybody has access to treatment if they're having trouble. Everybody has access to symptom management. And so you're watched very closely. So even if there's something going on that's not related to your MS, more than likely it's going to be found and treated if you're in a clinical trial. And so there are many advantages. And then there's also the advantage of participating and increasing the knowledge about the community, because as we've talked about earlier, we see the risk is higher. We see that the outcomes are poorer in some of these groups, but we don't understand why. And so being a participant in these trials, if it is something you want to do, right, um, is a key to us understanding why we see these outcomes. So is there a biologic difference that we need to address? Are the treatments similar in terms of their actual efficacy or effectiveness? Or is it more, we just need to work on the social determinants of health? And the answer to that is we don't know, and we won't know until we increase the diversity in our clinical research.
So everything you just said makes perfect sense in helping an individual decide that they might want to participate in clinical research. But then they get home and that older family member hears about it and says, look, I remember the Tuskegee experiment.
Right.
What's their
Right.
solution in their family? What is their solution to that? It's not even a question, it's sort of a statement of fact.
Yeah. I mean, so it's true. I remember when I first went to medical school, my grandmother, before I went to medical school, she never let any students or anyone talk to her because she didn't want to be experimented on. so, so definitely there is that concern. But I think that, one of the things to keep in mind is that a lot of the ways that we do research have changed. There are very strict rules in place before any type of experiment can be done on a person. So, we recently started the African American MS registry, and it took us months just to be able to put in place for people to fill out a questionnaire. So, we're not even talking about examining anyone, giving them any type of treatment. It took months of going through review boards at different institutions just for you to answer questions. And so you can imagine how much more scrutiny there is and how much more ethical evidence you have to have before you can even get to giving someone a medication or doing a procedure on them. So there are many, many different levels in place to try to ensure that there's nothing done that's unethical and that we're not harming anyone when they're enrolled in a clinical trial. And so I think that's a point of reassurance, is to know that you can't just do those types of studies, that really the clinical trial system has been reformed, where there's lots of scrutiny if there's anything being done to people, even just answering a one-page questionnaire.
The Tuskegee experiment led to a very significant lawsuit being filed, which
Yeah.
actually led to a presidential apology and passage of these laws that protect people now.
Absolutely.
And Maria wrote in, she wants to know where she can go to learn about clinical trials and studies.
Yeah, so absolutely. There are a couple of different places. So the MS Society has on their website a list of some of the current clinical trials that are going on in different parts of the country. Also, clinicaltrials.gov is a site that we often send people to. It can be difficult to navigate. I always suggest that in a person's area, there often is an academic center or an MS center. They often have a list of the trials that are available, or sometimes, depending on what center I'm working at, they'll give our research department a call and say, do you have any clinical trials going? And then the other place, of course, is to ask your neurologist. You can always go to your neurologist or whoever is caring for your MS and say, do you know about any clinical trials that are going on in the area? And do are you enrolling in trials, or do you know any sites where I may qualify for a clinical trial?
Can you tell us about the MS Minority Research Engagement Partnership Network?
Yes. So I've been a member of a founding member of the MS Research Partnership Network since it started several years ago. And there were really a group of us that were trying to understand, the hesitancy about conducting research or about being involved in research. And it's a really great collaborative with there are physicians, there are people living with MS, there are advocacy partners from the MS Society and our other societies, as well as industry partners. And so it's a really great group of folks who try to come together and find solutions. And so a couple of the solutions that we founded were we did a survey looking at research attitudes in different communities. And what we found was that by and large, there were about 200 Black people in the study and 200 close to 200 Hispanic Latinx people with MS in the study, as well as a large number of Caucasian or white patients. And what we found was that by and large, people had positive attitudes toward research. They did not know where to find out about studies, or their doctors hadn't asked them to be a part of a study. So I think that, it certainly has helped bridge that knowledge gap. And out of that, we've developed some toolkits for researchers about the importance of diversity in research and asking, diverse patients to be involved. And we hope to develop some communications for people living with MS and their care partners as well about the importance of research.
We've seen evidence that some racial and ethnic minority groups continue to be disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we can switch gears from research to something happening in our midst, are these some of those inequities in the social determinants of health that are contributing to these awful outcomes?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, the same has been true for MS. So there was data that was recently presented at one of our major conferences called ECTRIMS, which, unfortunately, we didn't get to have in Europe this year. But when we looked at the US data about what predicted or what were some of the factors related to worse outcomes with COVID, certainly Black people was actually being a Black person put you at risk for worse outcomes, unfortunately. So it's true not only in the general population, but at least here in the US, also in the MS population. So social determinants of health play a huge part. If we think about things like essential workers, often minority people here in the US are our essential workers at our grocery stores, at our gas stations, on the front lines, where they have to interact with people on a daily basis, which increases their risk and increases their exposure. Also, if you look at hospitals, often the nursing staff or some of the janitorial staff are often minority people of color as well. So when you think about who's kind of at the highest risk, who has to go out, who may be exposed, we're talking about these groups of people. Also, minorities tend to live in multi-generational households. So, I had, unfortunately, an example in my own family where my son and my children were exposed to COVID through our homeschool, unfortunately. And by the time we realized he was exposed, he had been to my mother's house, and my grandmother lived with my mother. And so that resulted in my grandmother and my mother getting sick. And unfortunately, my grandmother passed away. And so we have these multi-generational households where everybody's taking care of everybody. So if one person has to go out and be the breadwinner, or there's someone that's coming in, such as a grandchild, that person could potentially expose a wide number of people. And then the other thing is that they're densely populated areas. So again, if you live in a densely populated area, whether it's apartments or certain types of housing, small areas, larger groups of people, you're more likely to be exposed on a continual basis and have potentially poor outcomes. And then one more thing I want to say, there also is, I think, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, I do think that bias played a large part, or at least some part, in people's access to certain treatments. So when we first started talking about antiviral treatments like remdesivir, et cetera, again, I had a personal experience where, my mother's a 75-year-old woman with comorbidities. She goes to the hospital. The first thing they say is, "Oh, you don't qualify." And I'm like, well, why not? And then someone else comes along and is like, no, you actually do qualify, but if someone just takes a cursory glance and doesn't do that extra work or do that extra digging, there are people who are overlooked. There are people who are sent home until they come back with severe, severe illness, and unfortunately they pass away.
And I'm very sorry to hear that your grandmother had to be part of that
Thank you so
group,
much.
certainly.
Thank you so much.
One of the sad ironies of this phenomenon is COVID vaccination rates among these same communities where they are
Yes.
most at risk, yet they are least getting that vaccination.
Yeah.
What's in the way there? What's stopping people from being vaccinated?
So
vulnerable?
So I think and I actually was in a meeting earlier today where we were talking about COVID vaccination, particularly with the MS community, but when you think about it at large, I think a lot of it has to do with mistrust. I think that the name of our vaccination project here was a bit of a misnomer. So when you call things something like warp speed, even though it was an amazing collaborative, right? And it was kind of like all the stars aligned, the technology was in place, it had been studied for years, there was money that was available, there were volunteers, and all the stars aligned to be able to allow a vaccine to come out fairly rapidly. There is this misconception that maybe there were corners cut, or maybe there wasn't research done appropriately in order for this to, come out. And so I think that that has a lot to do with it. I think education also has a lot to do with it. People's sources of education. There are plenty of conspiracy videos out there, and so, if you don't have a family member who's trying to educate folks, they just kind of continue to, you know, to perpetuate some of these myths. And then I also think it still also has to do with access, right? So, I was able to get a vaccine, fortunately, where I work. My mom and my mother-in-law had me to kind of surf around and ask my friends, where are you getting vaccines? So again, it's still access, right? So if, you don't find out that so-and-so is offering vaccines until the appointments are all gone, but somebody else has a source that tells them, hey, I'm going to put you on the list, or I'm going to get you here, you still have difficulty with access.
So what can you tell our audience about the safety of the vaccine for people with MS?
Yeah, so, we don't have information about the number of people in the clinical trials that actually had MS. We do know that there were people in the original clinical trial. So I think the first thing to recognize is that there were very large number of people, large numbers of people in these studies. So for the Pfizer trial, there were over 35,000 people in the study. For the Moderna, there were over 25,000 people. Half of those got vaccine, half of those did not. They got placebo, which is what you do when you don't have a treatment for something. But you're talking out the gate, at least 25 to 30,000 people who've received a treatment, okay, which is almost unheard of for any type of treatment. I think also, there are lots of things that are going around allergic reactions, things of that nature. I always recommend someone speak with their physician, and that for the most part, people have tolerated the vaccine well. So well over 1 million people here in the US have been vaccinated. I talked with some of my colleagues across the pond in the UK, 18 million people have been vaccinated, okay? And there certainly have not been a large number of severe outcomes that have been reported, with millions of people who've been vaccinated. And again, the main thing is talk to your healthcare provider, make the best decision for you. But by and large, most people should receive the vaccine because the potential of developing COVID, could be life-threatening. And so, the vaccination provides protection against that.
Well, we've discussed disparities in healthcare among members of minority groups. We've also looked at the intersection between socioeconomic, environmental, and genetic determinants and their impact on health outcomes. Let's talk for a couple minutes about health equity for people in minority populations who are living with MS. From the healthcare provider standpoint, what can healthcare teams do to make sure quality healthcare is being delivered to members of minority groups who are living with MS?
So I think education is key. I think education and self-advocacy. So I'm a big advocate or encourager of self-advocacy. So when I sit down with my patients to try to explain things to them, I make sure that they understand. We have to take that extra time to make sure that people understand what the plan is, why we're doing what we're doing, and have an opportunity to ask questions. I think that I also encourage people to ask questions. I encourage people to reach out to their healthcare providers if what the plan is not working. And so I think we as healthcare providers have to keep that line of communication open. And we have to get out of this, medicine is no longer paternalistic. We don't tell people this is what you're going to do and then come back and, blah, blah, blah. We make shared decisions. So shared decision making. But we as healthcare providers have to humble ourselves and recognize that although we know a lot, we don't know that person's body or their home environment. So we have to have an equal exchange and take into account people's preferences and their needs when we're making decision plans.
Well, there are people living with MS who will still hear from their healthcare provider that they need to take control of their health. Can you
Mhm.
tell us what that means and where you start?
Yes. So I tell people this all the time, right? So I have certain Dr. Mitzi-isms. So one common Dr. Mitzi-ism is there's a part you play, there's a part medicine plays. There is no medicine that gets rid of the part you play in your own health, right? So you come to the doctor, we come up with a plan to treat your MS, but you still got to eat right, try to exercise to the best of your ability, get sleep at night, try to decrease your stress, right? So you start a little bit at a time, right? So it's difficult for anyone to do a whole life overhaul, right? But you pick one area and you focus on that area. So if the biggest thing you're dealing with is stress, let's find ways to deal with stress. Let's do some meditation. Let's get some therapy if we need. Let's do medications if we need to. And then once we kind of work on that, then let's work on that diet, right? And then once we do that, let's get the body moving a little bit more. So it's a journey. We're not all going to get it done at one time, but you pick one thing, you work on that, and when you master that, then you move on to the next thing.
Well, speaking of the things that people can do that are their part, how can people living with MS best stay informed? Where can they find reliable information?
Yes, so this is also a biggie. So I absolutely direct people to the MS Society. I direct people to our foundations, the MSF, the MSAA. I also direct people to your podcast. You're on my list, Jon. I tell everybody to listen to you because you have such engaging, content. You have very great guests, and you ask, those important questions. So, kind of starting with your societies, starting with some of your large patient organizations, starting with your podcast. If you start with number one of the podcast and work with the MS Society and look at the things they have there, that's going to take you a while to get through. But you definitely want valid sources of information because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So you want to go with, our societies, our foundations, and certainly with Jon's podcast.
Well, I'll have to say that sounds like very wise advice. So I appreciate that very much. Um,
Absolutely.
Tell me, what can you share with members of minority populations who are living with MS about the importance and the safety of MS therapies?
Yes. So, one of the things that I think is very important when we have our treatment conversations is to talk about what the goal is, right? So, what is our goal? What are we trying to achieve? We are trying to prevent relapses, we're trying to slow progression, and we're trying to prevent lesions on MRI that, even though they may not cause you symptoms now, may cause you symptoms later on in life. I think that one of the things that we have to think about when we think about safety is that certainly there are risks with medications, right? Any type of therapy. And I definitely don't think we should downplay that, but there also is a risk of bad MS. And so we have to figure out what line we feel comfortable with in terms of, what the risks versus the benefits are of certain therapies and which one we think will be the best fit for that individual person. But treatment is absolutely important. MS is a disease we've known about since the 1800s. So 1868, MS was first recognized as a disease. We had no FDA approved therapies until 1993. So the scientific community has had a long time to see how people do without therapy. And by and large, for the most part, people do worse. Okay. We know that the therapies help. We know that the therapies have changed the actual natural history of MS. There are many less people in wheelchairs and people that can do and function and continue their regular life. So it's extremely important to get treated, talk to your doctor, figure out what the best option is for you.
Are there ways that members of minority groups can actually raise awareness about the ways that they're experiencing MS, as well as some of those unique needs and struggles that you've mentioned today?
Absolutely. So there are a variety of forums. Certainly there are some through the MS Society. There are also different Facebook groups that are raising awareness. I know of several particular groups within the Black community. There are certain you know eh, so I would encourage people first to get involved with volunteering somewhere, whether it's through the MS Society, et cetera. Also, it's okay to tell your story, right? To tell your story to friends, to tell your stories to others. You never know who you may encounter that has MS. And certainly, if you want to do things on a larger scale, there are, many advocates who are doing Facebook Live shows, who are doing podcasts. So you have to kind of get in where you fit in. But your story is important. Your voice is important. So even if you let that be heard within your community, it could certainly make a difference for other people who are living with MS.
Well, we covered some really important topics today. You've shared a lot of great information with us. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our audience to remember?
So I think the first is that there are many factors that affect health outcomes besides just your physical health, and those are those social determinants of health. I think another thing that I would want people to take away is that you are your own best advocate. You know your body. If you're having issues or concerns, reach out to your healthcare team. And if your healthcare team does not listen to you or you feel like your concerns are not being heard, it's okay to find a new healthcare team. And it's okay to get a second opinion. MS is a journey, and so you have to have someone along that journey that you feel comfortable with. And then the third thing I think I would leave is seek support, right? You can't do this alone. Connect with the MS community, whether it's through the society, whether it's through different podcasts, whether it's through different forums. Connect with the community and find that sense of community and support because it's needed, not only during this pandemic, but definitely throughout your journey with MS.
Well, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I think we have time for a couple of more questions from
Sure,
our audience. I see that,
let's go.
let's see. Lisa wants to know if there are MS research studies on Asians and populations besides Black and Latinx populations.
Yes, so there are. So we don't have a lot of studies on Asian Americans with MS, but there are many studies that have come out, from Japan and China, and that's where we get this idea of what we call optical spinal MS. So the optic nerves of the spinal cord being involved is actually what's called the Japanese variant of MS. And so we see that in African American communities. One of the difficulties with studying Asian and other communities here in the US is that they're very small. But certainly one of the objectives of the MS Research Partnership Engagement Network is to broaden the communities that we are looking at aside from, Black and Hispanic. We would love to look at the American Indian population. And so we're getting some studies together to try to look at that group as well as the Asian population.
Kyla wrote in asking, as a newly diagnosed Black woman, where can I find support from other Black women who are living with MS?
Yeah, so there are a couple of advocacy groups. There are a couple of groups or communities of Black women with MS. One of them is called We Are Ill. Victoria Reese is one of the co-founders of that group, and they have a very large group of maybe 1,000 Black women with MS. They do different programs. Actually, I'm supposed to do an IG Live with them, I think next week. And then there's a podcast called Myelin and Melanin. And so they talk about issues specific to MS and Black women as well. So those are the two that kind of come to mind off the top of my head that are specific for Black women in MS.
Let's see. Ronald is wondering if access to MS therapies is limited for some minority groups who may be living with MS.
So, so access to therapy can be limited in terms of access to care, but most of the therapies are actually widely available. And sometimes it's actually easier to get therapy if you don't have insurance than if you're underinsured. So most of the time, by the time I see patients in clinic, I can pretty much get them on to some type of MS therapy. The key is that you've got to get to see somebody who will put you on therapy. But most of the therapies are pretty widely available, especially for those who are uninsured.
And Dan is wondering why this topic has gained so much interest from researchers.
So this is a topic that I've been passionate about for some time. So I live in the South, I live in Georgia. And, coming along in my training, there was this idea that MS was really a disease mostly of young white women, which, as I said, worldwide is true. But when I looked at my waiting room, it was mostly Black people. And they were very disabled. And oftentimes my patients were very disabled because it took them years to get diagnosed, or they saw someone who was putting them on a treatment and kept them on the same treatment even though they were going downhill. And so, it has become, I think, important because it is a reflection of our larger society, right? A lot of the problems that we're dealing with in the MS community are not unique. So the difficulty getting people enrolled in clinical trials and lack of diversity is something that's across all areas of medicine: breast cancer, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. When I go to conferences, everybody's saying the same thing: how do we get people in trials? Also, when we think about the social determinants of health and health equity and how these inequities exist, it's the same. Look at COVID. And so I think that COVID has really shined a light again on these disparities and kind of allowed people to see in real time what this means in terms of outcome. Blacks are roughly 2 times more likely to die of COVID than whites. Native Americans are close to 3 times more likely to die of COVID. And so it's a matter of life and death. And so that urgency has now spread to many other areas of medicine where many of us are trying to help find solutions, and actually are able to get access to resources to help work on some of these things that have been long-standing problems.
Well, I want to thank all of you who have submitted your questions today, and I want to thank you, Dr. Williams, for being with us.
Thank you so much, John. It's absolutely my pleasure.
I think that one of the best things that anyone can do for themselves, especially during these uncertain times, is to make sure that the information they're getting is credible and reliable. So we'd like to share some resources with you, and these are resources that you can count on. I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. And I'll also remind you that the MS Society brings people together through peer connection programs like self-help groups, the MS Friends Helpline and Paired Program, and the National MS Society Facebook community. To learn more, please visit the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org. And for more information about MS research studies, you can visit the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/research. You can connect with Dr. Mitzi Joy Williams at drmitzijoymd.com. On Twitter, she's at NerdyNeuroMD, and on Instagram at The Nerdy Neurologist. Every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, I continue the conversation that we start here. So I hope you'll take a few minutes and give Real Talk MS a listen. You'll find the Real Talk MS podcast at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Walk MS 2021 is coming, and this year, Walk MS will meet you where you are to connect, celebrate, and make a difference like never before. For more information, please visit walkms.org. You can connect with the National MS Society along with others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I encourage you to like all those posts, subscribe to the channels, and make sure you're on the Society's mailing list so you'll continue to receive the latest information on MS and updates on upcoming programs just like this one. I'd like to thank Dr. Mitzi Joy Williams for joining us today, and I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us for your great questions. Please remember that a recording of this webinar is available or will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and on YouTube. And I hope you'll join us for next Friday's edition of Ask an MS Expert, when Columbia University clinical neurologist and researcher, Dr. Victoria Levitt, will be with us to discuss cognitive evaluation and interventions. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webinar is important. So you'll see a survey pop up in a moment when we close out the webinar. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to that survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute and fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Mitzi Joy Williams and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.